Hi again. Okay, the next videos I'm going to upload are going to be covering the Strawson and Donnellan readings that you've been assigned. I'm going to be briefer about in discussing these in videos than I was with Russell and Frege, mainly because I think uh, both of these papers are easier for you to read on your own and pick up what's going on. They're a little less dense, a little less arcane and distant from the way we talk about things now. They are both much more recent. So the Frege paper was published in 1892, the Russell paper in 1905. Strawson's On Referring was published in 1950, the Donnellan papers in the 60s. That may still sound like ancient history, but it's considerably more recent than the other things we've read. Okay. Now, there are two main things I'm going to talk about in the Strossen. I'll talk about at least one of them in this video, and if I plan things well, I'll do a separate video for the other thing. The two things that I want to talk about are the distinction that you see him making on this page here between a sentence, a use of a sentence, and utterance of a sentence. That's one thing. The second thing is the idea of presupposition. Okay. The reason why I want to make sure I give you a video on these things, why I would have wanted to make sure I lectured on these things if we were still meeting face to face, is it's very easy, especially in a class like this, to take the important thing. It's very easy to think what I think would be a mistake that the debate between Russell and Strawson, to the extent there is a debate, is just a debate about empty names or empty descriptions, about what happens to a sentence that has a definite description like the present King of France when there is no such person. So, as we'll see, as you've already seen, Russell thinks a sentence like that is just plain false. Frege thinks a sentence like that is neither true nor false, and Strawson's going to agree with Frege, although he doesn't mention Frege here. I think, as far as I know, Strawson isn't likely to have read Frege. Frege sort of gets revived in interest in Frege among English language philosophers gets revived a little bit later than this. But a lot of the things that you'll see Strawson argue for here are anticipated in the sense and reference paper we looked at. Okay. It's true that Russell and Strawson disagree about those kinds of sentences, but I think the best way to approach Strawson's paper is to look at what kind of advances it makes, what sort of insights it has about how to think about language. And I think this distinction here that I'm going to talk about in this video is definitely an advance. It definitely clarifies how to think about the kinds of things that we've been talking about. You might, in the end, wind up agreeing with Strawson or agreeing with Russell about the truth, falsity, or otherwise of sentences like "the King of France is bald." But I think even if you wind up agreeing with Russell, this is a step forward. And it's the sort of thing I would hope to see you talk about in an exam answer if you answer a question about Russell and Strawson on empty names, empty definite descriptions. Okay, so let's talk about this distinction. So the distinction here, I guess there's two versions of it. There's the version for a sentence and the version for an expression. And here, Strawson's using the phrase an expression to mean something like a denoting phrase in Russell's terminology, or a referring expression, something like the King of France, or the Queen of England, or the tallest student in this class, or anything like that. I guess those were all definite descriptions. Doesn't have to be a definite description. A proper name counts too, so Roger counts as an expression, as a denoting phrase. Indefinite descriptions work too. A mother, that's an indefinite description because it's a description that's introduced by the indefinite article, that is the word a or an. Okay. So what's the distinction here? You might be familiar with something that gets called the type-token distinction. Maybe you've run into this in like a metaphysics class. There's something similar going on here. Okay, so let's write out Strawson's three things. We have a sentence, which is to be distinguished from a use of a sentence, and that is to be distinguished again from an utterance of a sentence. Okay, let's start with utterances. So if you're familiar with the type-token distinction, you might think of utterances as tokens of a particular type. Now, an utterance, I think it's helpful to think of an actual, like, physical act of making certain sounds by pushing a bunch of air out of your throat or whatever. So, like, here are two distinct utterances of the same sentence. I'm going to pick a sentence. Here's my example sentence. Let's go with I hope you are healthy. Here's a thing I might say. So here are two distinct utterances. Here's the first one. I hope you are healthy. I hope you are healthy. Now, I was trying to make those two things sound exactly the same. But look, one of them happened earlier in time than the other one. That's enough for them to be different. If you and I both say the same thing, but like the same words at exactly the same time, those are still two separate utterances, because one came out of my mouth, one came out of your mouth. So a particular spatio-temporally located instance of producing something that expresses a sentence, some sounds or maybe some marks on paper, that counts as an utterance. Okay. We might want to say, in fact, I did say this, my two utterances that we looked at, I said, I hope you are healthy, and then I said the same thing again. Those are both utterances of the same sentence. So different utterances, same sentence. Why is it the same sentence? Because I use the same words. That's enough. Okay, maybe there are going to be some cases where we want to say you use the same words, but it's a different set. But look, I mean, in this case, it's enough to say the fact that I was saying the same words makes it the same sentence. The fact that I said them at different times makes them different utterances. Okay, so that much I think Strossen would acknowledge is nothing new. But I think really the important thing here in this paper is he's going to make a lot of work out of the distinction between a sentence and a use of a sentence, where a use of a sentence is not the same thing as an utterance. So the two utterances I gave of this sentence, we might want to say, were using the sentence the same way, so the same use. What might be a difference? Well, so imagine I have a Skype office hour, a Skype call with two of you who are enrolled in this class. I'm going to make up names that start with A and B, so I'm not talking about anyone specific. Suppose I talk to Anne and Bob. I talk to Anne at 12 o'clock and Bob at 1 o'clock. I might say to Anne, I hope you're healthy. I might later on say to Bob, I hope you're healthy. Those are two distinct utterances just because I've said them at different times. They're the same sentence because I use the same words. But we might want to say they're different uses. Because in the first case, when I say you, I'm talking about Anne. In the second case, when I say you, I'm talking about Bob. So I'm using the same sentence in different ways. So it's a different use. So use one, Roger hopes Anne is healthy. Use two, Roger hopes Bob is healthy. We might try to spell out the difference in uses those ways. Okay, so Strawson uses examples involving the King of France. You'll see his examples. He imagines somebody saying the King of France is wise during the reign of Louis the 14th, and then some other person saying the King of France is wise during the reign of Louis the 15th. And I guess one of those kings is wise and the other one was not. I think the 15th is the bad one. 14th is the Sun King, I think. Anyway, you can look this stuff up. So he'd say, look, they're saying the same sentence, but they're using it differently. One is using it to talk about Louis XIV, the other one's using it to talk about Louis XV. Okay, that's the distinction. Why does that matter? Here are some questions we can ask about, say, a sentence. We can ask, is it true? We can ask of an expression rather than a sentence. What does it refer to? Or does it refer? So during the reign of Louis XIV or Louis XV, the expression the King of France does refer, it refers to different people. But now the expression the current King of France doesn't refer to anybody. Okay, that's one kind of question. So for sentences, we can ask, is it true? For expressions, we can ask, does it refer? What does it refer to? Let's put both of those questions in. Here's another kind of question, though. Does it have a meaning? Or what does it mean? And that's something we can ask about either a sentence or an expression. Okay. Strawson says, Russell makes a mistake by thinking both of these kinds of questions apply at this level. Whereas, in fact, the question about being meaningful applies to sentences, but the question about truth or about reference only applies to uses of sentences. So, take a sentence like this one. Suppose there's some student whom I don't hope is healthy. Oh, that sounds cruel. Imagine a cruel version of me. Suppose I'm lying when I talk to Bob, but I was telling the truth when I talked to Anne. Well then, do we want to say, when you ask this, is the sentence, I hope you are healthy, is that true or false? It doesn't have a clear answer. It's true if I use it to talk about Anne, but it's false if I use it to talk about Bob. Maybe I'm not cruel. Maybe I just haven't thought about Bob. I don't hope Bob is healthy just because I haven't thought of him. That's bad too. I don't like this story. Anyway, imagine it. Imagine this was a story. The point is, Strawson's going to say this kind of question shouldn't be applied to the sentence because that's something that's held in common between both of my uses, right? When I say, I hope you're healthy, talking to each person, I'm using the same sentence, but in one case, I'm telling the truth, and in the other case, I'm not. So, truth or falsity should show up here. Likewise, reference, what a name refers to, that's a property of a use of an expression. So, the King of France, during the reign of, let me just write this in, reference shows up here. The King of France during the reign of Louis XIV refers to one person. During the reign of Louis XV, it refers to another person. Nowadays, it refers to nobody at all. So that tells you that reference is not a property of an expression, but of a use of an expression. Okay. I guess you could say, if I like say this thing not to Anne or to Bob, but just like to the empty space over there in my room. Maybe I don't. maybe then the expression you doesn't manage to refer to anybody because there's nobody there. I say, I hope you are healthy. There's nobody there. I've just kind of failed to say anything or to express anything. Okay. On the other hand, whether something's meaningful, that is that's a property of a sentence. Okay. So Strawson thinks notice something that happens here. Strawson thinks a sentence can be meaningful, and yet a use of it might not have a truth value. He thinks meaning is not a matter of having a truth value, but of something like giving a rule that tells you which utterances of that sentences are going to amount to which uses. So a rule for a sentence like this might say, well, for any given utterance of this thing, you have to check who the speaker is to figure out whom the name I refers to, the pronoun I refers to, and figure out who the audience is, who the second person is, to figure out who the pronoun you refers to. Okay, so the meaning of this sentence is something like that rule that says, here's how to figure out who this is, here's how to figure out who this is. Likewise, the meaning of a sentence like, the King of France is wise, will tell you something about how to figure out who the King of France, that expression, refers to. Go to France and check who the monarch is. If it's male, then that's the king. Otherwise, you haven't got one. Was France ever ruled by a queen? I don't know. Anyway, they don't teach us this in Canada. So, go to France, figure out who the male monarch is. If there is no such one, well then, you haven't managed to refer to anybody. But otherwise, you're referring to the male monarch of France, and you are saying that that person is wise. Okay. So, Strawson also thinks, so I told you he thinks that Russell makes a mistake by thinking both kinds of questions apply to sentences. So Russell seems to support his view about the logical structure of sentences with definite descriptions on the basis of a confusion about these two kinds of things and where these questions about meaning and reference or truth value apply. I will leave you to read the paper and see what sort of argument Strawson gives for that kind of thing. I will just note, just as a bit of terminology, just in case this isn't obvious, Strawson's going to use significance. So significance as a synonym for meaning, right? A meaningful sentence we could also call a significant one. That doesn't mean that it's like important or something. It's not that sense of significant. It's just that it signifies something. To mean something is to signify something. So you'll sometimes see him say that. And he'll like attribute an argument to Russell where Russell seems, according to Strawson, to think if a sentence is meaningful or significant, then it must be either true or false. Only nonsense sentences would lack a truth value, therefore, etc., etc. And Strawson's going to think that's just a mistake. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I will come back in another video and talk to you about presupposition. That's not actually a word that appears in this paper, but first of all, we saw that word in Frege. Why am I talking about this? I said it would be in the next video. It'll be in the next video. I'll be back in a second.